My son looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't own anything here." The words didn't break me. They sharpened me, because the very next morning he'd learn exactly how wrong he was. Blood may be thicker than water, but respect is thicker than blood. And when a child forgets who built the walls around him, sometimes you have to remind him whose name is carved into the foundation. What I did next would not only take back my home, it would leave him standing in the snow with nothing but a suitcase and a silence he couldn't talk his way out of. Before we continue, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. This is my true story, from the frozen edge of Alaska, and the day I taught my own son a lesson he'll never forget. I was 21 when I first set foot on the frozen edge of Alaska. Back then, the winters felt like a dare, the kind of cold that steals your breath before you can even curse it. But I stayed. I stayed because I believed a home wasn't just walls and a roof, it was proof that you belonged somewhere, no matter how hard the wind tried to push you out. The house started as a shell, just rough boards, open gaps where the wind slid through at night. I remember sleeping in my coat, listening to the walls groan under the weight of the snow. My hands blistered from hauling water when the pipes froze, from chopping wood until my knuckles cracked and bled. But piece by piece, I made it ours. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke in winter. The floors creaked in places I never bothered to fix, each sound a memory. I used to hum while sealing the windows with plastic before the first frost, pressing my palms against the thin film to feel the heat stay inside. Those small victories kept me going. Every extra dollar I made went into keeping this place alive. I worked mending fishing nets in the harbor, my fingers raw from salt and cold. In the summer, I cleaned cabins for tourists. In the winter, I shoveled driveways for neighbors too old to lift a shovel. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. I didn't spend on myself. I didn't travel. I didn't buy new clothes unless the old ones tore beyond repair. All my savings went toward my son, his school fees, his clothes, his chance to have something better. I told myself that if I just worked a little harder, he'd never know the taste of struggle. When he was a boy, he used to curl up by the wood stove while I cooked, asking questions about everything: how to tie a fishing knot, how to fix a squeaky hinge. I taught him because I wanted him to stand on his own someday. When he turned 18, I cashed out the little savings I had and sent him to college in the city. I remember handing him the envelope, my fingers reluctant to let go. It wasn't just money, it was my winters, my summers, my years. He came back after a few years, tired, defeated. His first business had failed. I didn't scold him, I just opened the door and said, "This house is yours too, we'll figure it out." And we did. I worked double shifts at the cannery, while he tried again. When that failed, I still didn't complain, but something shifted over the years. He stopped asking about my work, stopped noticing the way I limped after long days on my feet. He started talking about modernizing the house, ripping out the old floors, replacing the stove. I smiled, but inside, I knew what those words meant. Still, I kept giving. I fixed what I could, saved what I could. I was building more than a house. I was building a safety net, for him, for the family. I thought we'd be. Some nights when the wind screamed through the trees and rattled the windows, I'd lie awake and think about all the storms we'd survived here. Ice storms, power outages, nights when the generator failed and we slept in our coats again. But the house always stood, and so did I. I thought that meant something to him. I thought the years of sacrifice were written into these walls, impossible to erase. I was wrong, and the moment I realized just how wrong I was the moment everything began to change. When my son came back to Alaska, I thought it was a blessing. It had been nearly 5 years since he'd last walked through the door. I'd imagined he'd return older, wiser, maybe even grateful. Instead, he brought someone with him. His new wife. From the moment she stepped inside, I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked around the house, as if she was appraising it, not visiting a home. Her nails tapped on the wooden banister, like she was testing its quality. Her perfume was sharp, foreign, filling the air until it buried the scent of wood smoke that had lived here for decades. At first, I told myself I was being sensitive. They were settling in, adjusting to a different life, but small things began to change. The old rocking chair by the window, the one I used on quiet winter nights, was moved into storage without asking me. The spare room where I kept my sewing machine was suddenly their office. Doors that had always stayed open were now closed, locked sometimes. One afternoon, I heard her on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low, but the words were clear. If we can convince her to sell, we could get something bigger. The word convince echoed in my head, like a slow drip. Soon, they began making suggestions in that same polite but persistent tone. We should remodel, we should take down the old cabinets. Maybe rent the place out, and move closer to the city. I listened, I nodded. I didn't agree, but then came the day it all cracked open. It was late evening, snow was falling in thick sheets, muffling the world outside. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, when my son walked in. His wife stood just behind him, arms crossed. He didn't sit down, he didn't smile. He just said it, flat, like it was fact. You don't own anything here anymore. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence between us. My hand froze on the wooden spoon. The steam from the pot curled into my face, but I didn't feel its warmth. My fingers began to tremble. Not from fear, but from the weight of realizing that my own child had been carrying this thought long before he spoke it. I looked at him, searching for the boy who used to sit by the wood stove and ask me how to tie fishing knots. All I saw was a man who believed he had already won something from me. The air felt heavy, thick. My hearing dulled, like I was underwater. His wife shifted her weight, her eyes darting to him as if waiting for me to break. I didn't. I set the spoon down gently on the counter. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I heard him call my name once, but I didn't answer. Later that night, I went into the room they had claimed as an office. It was empty. A stack of papers sat on the desk, legal documents, half-filled forms about property transfer. I read enough to know the truth. He had already been moving the pieces without me. I slid the papers back into place and left the room as I'd found it. My steps were slow, deliberate. My face calm, because what I did next, they never saw coming. That night, I didn't sleep. The snow outside had stopped, but the cold inside me was sharper than any Alaskan wind. His words kept replaying in my head. You don't own anything here anymore. If he truly believed that, then he didn't know me at all. I waited until the house was silent, until the only sound was the slow ticking of the kitchen clock. Then I walked to the small storage room at the back of the house. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the air dry and still. The metal filing cabinet stood where it always had, tucked beneath a shelf of empty jars. My hands were steady as I unlocked it. One by one, I pulled out folders, tax receipts, old utility bills, photographs yellowing at the edges. And then there it was. The original property deed. The paper was brittle at the corners, but the ink was still clear. My name. My signature. No co-owner, no transfer. For a long time I just stared at it. This was more than proof. It was the heartbeat of my years of sacrifice, signed in my own hand. I slipped it into a thick envelope and placed it in my coat pocket. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I drove the long road into the nearest city. The frost clung to the windshield like spider webs, and the tires crunched over frozen gravel. Every mile I drove, the weight on my chest grew lighter. The local records office was warm, smelling faintly of coffee and paper. The clerk, a woman I'd known for years, pulled up the file without hesitation. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses and said the words I already knew. It's yours. Only yours. Still, I asked for certified copies. 3 of them. She stamped each one, the sound echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. On my way back, I stopped by the harbor. My old fishing net lay in the shed there, torn from the last season I'd used it. I sat on a crate, the cold seeping into my legs, and began mending it. The twine felt rough against my fingers, pulling tight with each knot, every loop, every tie. It was a reminder. A net doesn't work if it has holes. Neither does a plan. Over the next few days, I watched them carefully. I didn't confront. I didn't question. I listened. I noticed the phone calls they took in hushed tones, the envelopes that arrived from banks in the city, the way they kept measuring rooms with a tape measure. I started gathering my own evidence, photographs of the legal documents I'd found, copies of the mail that came addressed to both of them, with words like loan and valuation. One evening I called an old friend. He'd worked in town administration for decades, knew the ins and outs of property law better than anyone I trusted. We met in the back booth of a diner, the smell of coffee and fried eggs filling the air. I laid the papers out in front of him. He read them slowly, his brow furrowing. When he finally looked up, his voice was low. "You've got them, plain and simple. But if you're going to act, act clean. Act final." I nodded. The next morning at breakfast, my son talked casually about knocking out the kitchen wall to open up the space. His wife smiled, swirling her coffee, already planning where the new furniture would go. I kept my eyes on my plate, the smell of bacon and toast mixing with the scent of coffee. I didn't look up. I didn't speak. Inside I was already counting down the days. Because I had chosen the date, and when it came, they'd never forget it. It was still dark when I left the house. The snow crunched under my boots, each step crisp in the frozen air. My breath rose in slow clouds as I slid into the truck, the leather seat cold enough to sting. I didn't turn on the radio. This drive wasn't for music, it was for ending something. The streets into town were empty, only the faint glow of street lamps guiding the way. The courthouse sat heavy at the end of Main Street, tall stone walls, old wooden doors, and the kind of silence that carries authority. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust. My boots echoed on the tiled floor as I walked to the clerk's desk. I handed over the stack of documents, title proof, bank statements, a record of every quiet betrayal they'd tried to slip past me. The clerk read in silence, her eyes flicking up to mine once before she pressed the metal stamp down on the papers. The sound was sharp, final. It echoed in that empty office, like a gavel. By the time I left, the eviction was filed, and the joint account linked to the property was frozen. Not a cent could be touched without me. No shouting, no threats, just the law doing what it was meant to do. The drive back felt lighter, but my hands still gripped the wheel tight. This wasn't over. When I walked in, they were in the kitchen, laughing. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, masking the staleness that had grown between us. I poured myself tea, didn't say a word. My son glanced at me, a quick, curious look, but went back to his conversation. I waited until evening. The snow outside had turned to a soft drizzle, tapping against the windows. I asked them both to join me in the living room. My voice was calm, too calm. They sat across from me, side by side, the firelight throwing shadows across their faces. I unfolded the papers slowly, letting the sound of the crackling fire fill the silence. Then I read it, word for word: eviction, 30 days to vacate the property. Failure to comply would result in legal removal. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. His wife was the first to speak. Her voice was sharp, trembling at the edges. "This isn't legal. You can't just..." I cut her off with a single sentence. "It is legal." I checked. Twice, my son's mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands curled into fists against his knees. I didn't wait for them to recover. I folded the papers, set them on the coffee table, and stood. As I walked away, I could feel the weight of it settling on them, the shock, the disbelief, the realization that the ground they'd been standing on was never theirs. And they hadn't even begun to understand what else I had planned. They thought it would stay quiet, but in a town like ours, news travels faster than the wind off the bay. By noon the next day, people started showing up, carrying pie, lending tools they knew I didn't need, just checking in. Their eyes said more than their mouths ever would. The air was sharp, with winter cold, and every breath felt like a cloud between us. I could see curtains twitch across the street. They all knew. My son came first, stomping up the porch with that forced smile, the kind you wear when you're cornered, but won't admit it. His wife followed close behind, her coat pulled tight, eyes darting around like she was the one being hunted. He started talking fast, shaking his head, telling anyone who would listen that I'd lost my mind, that I was throwing my own blood out into the snow. The words stung, not because they were true, but because of how easily they came out of his mouth. I didn't argue. I waited. When the last neighbor had gathered near the steps, I went inside, came back out with the old metal box. The same box my husband kept under the bed, the one that held everything that mattered. I clicked it open slow, the sound sharp in the frozen air. Pulled out the deed, thick with age, edges worn from years of being touched, but never questioned. I held it up so every pair of eyes could see. My name, my signature. My right. No one spoke for a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. Then she broke it, his wife, with that high, brittle voice. She said it wasn't fair, that I owed them a chance to prove themselves. That's when old Bill, the fisherman from down the road, stepped forward. His face was weathered like driftwood, voice low, but cutting. Fair, lady, fair is when you work for what you take. Not when you bleed someone dry, 'cause they're too kind to stop you. The words hung there, heavy as the sky, before a storm. My son's face flushed red. He didn't look at me, just turned and went inside. Through the window, I watched him pull boxes from the closet. The scrape of cardboard on the floor was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Snow had started falling, soft at first, then steady, covering the steps, the truck bed, the footprints he left behind. By the time he came out carrying the last box, the marks in the snow were already fading. I stood in the doorway, not moving, not speaking, just watching as the truck pulled away. The tail lights disappeared into the white, and for the first time in years, the house felt still. But what he didn't know was that this was only part of what I'd set in motion. The silence after they left was heavy. Not the tense, waiting kind, but the stillness of a house finally breathing on its own again. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the marks they'd left behind. A cupboard door hanging off one hinge, a deep scrape along the floor, where a heavy chair had been dragged. The smell of their perfume still faint in the air, like a ghost that hadn't decided to leave yet. For the first time in months, I didn't hear anyone moving around, where they didn't belong. No footsteps above my head, no voices in the kitchen, just the low hum of the wood stove, and the ticking of the old clock. I started with the small things, tightening the screws on the cupboard, sliding the furniture back where it belonged, wiping the fingerprints off the glass door. It wasn't about cleaning, it was about reclaiming. Every repair was a reminder, this is my home, my work, my life. On the mantel sat the spare keys they'd always kept, just in case. I picked them up, felt the cold metal press into my palm, then I opened the stove door, the heat rushing against my face, and dropped them in. The keys curled and blackened, disappearing into the flames, until there was nothing left. It felt good. Final. Outside, the snow had eased, leaving the air crisp and sharp. I took the fishing net I'd left unfinished weeks ago, and sat on the porch, the twine rough under my fingers. Each knot I tied was steady, certain, like I was stitching myself back together. When it was done, I set it aside, and went to the edge of the porch. The ground was hard with frost, but I knelt anyway, pressing my hands into the cold soil. I planted the last of the season's flowers, small stubborn things that would fight to bloom even in the cold. Because that's what you do when life tries to take your ground, you plant something worth keeping. Later, I sat at the old writing desk. The will lay open in front of me, the same one my son always assumed had his name at the top. It used to. But as my pen moved across the paper, I felt the weight lift. The house, the land, everything would go to the community's fishing charity, the people who'd always looked out for me without asking for anything back. Blood ties may be strong, but respect, real respect, is what keeps love alive. Without it, love becomes a weapon. When I put down the pen, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. The snow started again that night, soft against the windows, erasing the last of the tire tracks from the driveway. By morning, it would be as if they'd never been here at all, but I'd remember, and I'd never let it happen again. Real family respects you. Not just your money.
I learned that the hard way, through silence, slammed doors, and empty smiles that hid hungry hands. And maybe you've felt it too, that sting, when the people you'd give everything to treat you like a wallet, instead of a person. Respect isn't bought, it's earned. And the moment someone stops giving it, you have every right to take back your space, your peace, and your life. If you've ever been used, lied to, or pushed aside by the very people you trusted, you're not alone. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, because these aren't just stories, they're warnings, they're lessons, and sometimes, they're the only proof that what happened to us was real. And if you believe that dignity matters more than blood, subscribe now. There are more real stories ahead, stories of justice, of people like you and me, who learned to stop begging for respect, and started taking it back. Because in the end, love without respect, isn't love at all.